Hello, I'm Shanika Taylor, Community Outreach Director for Gwinnett County. I'm pleased to be joined by Mike Glenn, who is a former Atlanta Hawks player and a commentator for Fox Sports, as well as a renowned author and historian. Mike is here today to give us a tour of his exhibit, Voting Rights: The Struggle for Equality. This exhibit focuses on the history of the struggle for voting rights from the Reconstruction era to the present day. If you've ever visited the Gwinnett Justice and Administration Center during the month of February, I'm sure you've had the privilege of seeing his past displays. Although we've had to shift the way we celebrate Black History Month this year, we could not pass up the opportunity to have Mike participate in our activities this month. So Mike, can you tell us how you got inspired to do this work of chronicling the African American experience throughout history?
Yes, Ms. Taylor. First, thank you very much for having me this February.
Absolutely.
And yes, I was writing my first book, Lessons in Success from NBA's Top Players, and I had quotes from various people in the books. I wanted to get those books where the quotes came from. I became a book collector and lost my mind. So first edition rare books were my passion. So I've been a collector for well over 20 years of these books. And eventually I wanted to share the content from these books. What good would it do me to have these books and learn these lessons and leave the books in my basement? So I decided I would love to have some exhibits that could share the information and knowledge with others.
Awesome. That's great. That's great. So tell us, how long have you been doing these exhibits?
Well, I started the exhibits about 20 years ago, but it was nothing like it is now. I had nothing framed. I just had some magazines and books, and I would place them on a table and let people come by and see them. And I noticed the reaction. Everybody loved them. I would have some Jets or Ebonies with Dr. King on the front, and people would feel better from just looking and reflecting on the contributions that were made before them. And I decided to get better and better and get frames and get newspapers and magazines and pictures and everything else since then.
Great, great. So what do you hope people gain from viewing your exhibits?
One, I hope they'll learn to be better citizens and to help develop the beloved community that Dr. King so often talked about, which of course includes justice for everyone. Everybody has opportunities to be the best that they can be and reach their talent. So I think it will help teach people lessons to learn to be better citizens and just go about their daily lives better and be inspired to become better scholars and students of history and what happened before us.
Thanks, Mike, for that background information. So with that, please walk us through the items that you have on display today.
It would be my pleasure, Ms. Taylor.
Great.
Let's go and start. You've already told everybody the name of the exhibit, Voting Rights: The Struggle for Equality. What I want to start with is Frederick Douglass. He said this in March of 1863, a little bit after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed and blacks were joining the military forces for the Union. He said, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there's no power on earth or under the earth which can deny that he has earned the right of citizenship in the United States." Now, by citizenship, he was also saying having voting rights and full equality is what Frederick Douglass was pleading for in March of 1863. Now, when the Civil War ended in April of 1865, he said, "Slavery is not abolished until a black man has the ballot." So we saw Frederick Douglass pushing for voting rights for blacks in 1865, and the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870. Now, it's very important to know that the 15th Amendment said citizens of the United States shall not be denied or abridged the right to vote by the nation or the individual states on account of color or race or previous conditions of servitude. So that was a celebration that blacks were parading in the streets, and it was a grand celebration, and it was thought that would be the thing that would bring equality and justice to blacks who had suffered so much in America. But notice that it said should not be abridged or denied. It did not positively affirm that you would have the right to vote. It just said the states nor the nation couldn't take away your right. That would be a factor later on, as we shall see. Now, let's take a look right here at the celebration for registration to vote. Black America was partying. They had people playing music and gathering to register to vote. I think that still should be celebrated, registering to vote and success from voting. And you see images, a very iconic image of in 1867, some blacks in the South had voted for the very first time. They were so proud to cast their ballot, and this was a very popular image in Harper's Weekly, a national magazine. Now, what was the result of all this voting and political rights? There were blacks that were sent to Congress. There were 22 United States congressmen and 2 senators in the U.S. Senate back during Reconstruction, which was between 1865 and 1877. You had a black senator, Hiram Revels, and later Blanche Bruce, who was not in this picture, and even this Congressman Jefferson Long from the state of Georgia. Now, progress still had to be made and demanded. As Frederick Douglass said, power never concedes anything without a demand, never did and it never will. So a lot of the states would try to prevent or suppress the votes of black people, black men at that time, and they had what was called a grandfather clause. What that meant is when you came to vote, they could give you a literacy test. It was up to the states to determine what were the qualifications for voting. So they would have a literacy test. But if you or your parents or grandparents had voted before 1866, like during the Civil War or before, you were exempt. You didn't have to go through a literacy test. So a lot of people that were illiterate and unlearned or even just couldn't pass sometimes a very difficult test, which was not fairly administered, I might add, but you could bypass it. That NAACP challenged that in the first landmark case. Now, the NAACP, let me advise you, was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It was founded on February 12th, 1909. That, by the way, was the 100-year anniversary of the birth of Abraham Lincoln. And their first landmark case was to defeat this grandfather clause in Oklahoma. And they got their first landmark victory. The high court said the grandfather clause is invalid. That was just one of the many ways that suppressing black votes was carried out. And speaking of that NAACP, not only W.E.B. Du Bois was a founder, but we should also know about the contributions of Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was a founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She was also a journalist, an educator. She investigated lynching. She gave a lot of the first assignments to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So we really should know her, an author, a speaker. She even traveled internationally to protest lynching and the fact that blacks did not have rights that was guaranteed to them by the Constitution. And she started the suffrage club in Chicago. And when the big march was held for women to have the right to vote, Ida B. Wells was right there among the women that protested for their rights. Now, of course, women did get the right to vote in 1920 because the 19th Amendment was finally passed and the political change was stricken from women in 1920. Now, black women did not have the right to vote at that time, but that was important because later on in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, all women had the right to vote, and because of this 19th Amendment, black women also had the right to vote. Very important addition to the Constitution, that amendment, the 19th Amendment. We should also look at 1927. Another way that blacks were kept from voting was what they call primaries, white primaries that had rules. Blacks could not vote in the white primaries in these southern states, and they had it in the guidelines, no blacks could vote. Maybe you could vote in the general election, but if one party dominated the state and if the Democratic primaries determined who would really be the person elected from that state, then your participation meant nothing, and blacks often could not vote in Democratic primaries at that time. Now keep in mind, blacks made up most of the Republican Party from the time of Abraham Lincoln through Theodore Roosevelt, all the way up until really Franklin Roosevelt's administration in the 1930s. So One of the ways was the white primaries. And there was a Dr. Nixon, along with the NAACP again, took this case all the way to the Supreme Court, that white primaries were against the Constitution. He tried to vote, and he took that case to the Supreme Court with the aid of the NAACP, I might add, and he won it. That was a big case. Texas primary law that was barring blacks from voting was overturned and called unconstitutional. Again, 1927 thought this would be a tremendous victory. But what the state of Texas did, they said instead of the state making these rules, because as you know, the 15th Amendment said the United States nor any state can abridge or deny blacks to vote. It did not say a Democratic Party couldn't abridge it. So they tried to put that responsibility to the Democratic Party. Now, one of the biggest cases in American history, Smith versus Allwright in 1944. And the brilliant attorney, Thurgood Marshall, argued that that was still unconstitutional and should be overturned because they had just given the power to the Democratic Party rather than the state was doing an unconstitutional act. He said that should still be unconstitutional, and Thurgood Marshall won that case, and the High Court had ruled that they could vote in Texas primaries. So once again, they had to fight for the right to vote. Suppression was still there, but Thurgood Marshall had won again. And now the states needed to follow the precedent set by the Supreme Court. And in our state of Georgia, there was a Primus King who was a religious leader and a barber. He challenged that in Columbus, Georgia. He tried to vote in the primaries and they would not let him vote. And that case had to be tested again. And in 1945, he was successful, and white primaries were outlawed and they never were a factor again. Thurgood Marshall thought that overruling white primaries was his biggest victory of his life, even more important than Brown versus Board of Education. Now, everybody knows about Brown versus Board of Education because that desegregated schools and black students and athletes could go to universities all across America. But he thought Smith versus Allwright was more important. And of course, it was challenged in 1945 by Primus King, who we should know, a hero from Columbus, Georgia. And now it was tested in many ways. We mentioned a couple of ways already. Grandfather clauses, we mentioned white primaries, but intimidation and even murder. Isaiah Nixon was a black man in Georgia who was trying to vote. He had 6 children. He was determined to vote in a white primary, and so he went to cast his ballot. He was ultimately killed and lynched for trying to vote. So murder was a way to suppress black votes also. And there's the proof from Isaiah Nixon with his 6 kids who was murdered. But also, we should look at some of the successes. In 1953, Rufus Clement, who was the president of Atlanta University, he was that president for 30 years, from 1937 until his death in 1967. He ran for the school board. And because now blacks had some right to vote and exercise their vote because of Smith versus Allwright, they had the power to put a black person on the school board, and Rufus Clement was the first one, and it made the New York Times that he was a victor there. And so that continued on black policemen. Mayor Hartsville was running for a 5th term in Atlanta, and John Wesley Dobb and Martin Luther King Sr. told the mayor that I've got about 20,000 votes in my pocket and we can cast them, but we need some black police. Now, all of a sudden, with political power, with the power to vote, there were black policemen in Atlanta and in the state of Georgia. Now, they had limited power, couldn't arrest white people, couldn't go in the office of the headquarters and things like that. But it was a start to more and better things for the future. But again, the power of voting had influenced all of that. Now keep in mind, this is all before Rosa had sat down. So this man was making a tremendous impact on the country and the world. Thurgood Marshall, one of the biggest heroes in American history. We all should know of Thurgood Marshall. And also, this was the landmark case that everybody's familiar with. May 17th, 1954, School segregation held unconstitutional, and many of the conservative or the whites in the southern states hated this ruling. They fought against it. But the case, Brown versus Board of Education, there was a man, Oliver Brown, who was suing in Kansas, Topeka, Kansas, because his daughter, Linda Brown, couldn't go to the school that was nearest to her. And this is a picture of Linda Brown, who just passed at 75 years. She was 75 years old a year or so ago. Linda Brown was the plaintiff that Oliver Brown and Thurgood Marshall had fought for in Brown versus the Board of Education. Also, we should be aware that 3 years later, there was a pilgrimage. Dr. King, Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr., 3 years later had a pilgrimage at Washington, D.C., and they were just applauding the victory of Brown versus Board of Education, and it was a prayer for the ballot. Dr. King was asking in this 3 years later, in 1957, he was saying, now we've got to have the ballot. A. Philip Randolph, who was a big leader too, also pointed out that, boy, this Dr. King at this point in 1957, he said he's a prophet for our times. He recognized that in 1957. That's before Birmingham and Nobel Peace Prize and many other things that Dr. King would do. But A. Philip Randolph pointed that out. In this prayer pilgrimage at Washington, D.C., in front of the Washington Monument, and this was in 1957, the third year anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education. So we should note that a lot of people do not know about that meeting that happened in front of the Capitol and the Lincoln Monument. They know about 1963, but they did not know about 1957, but they should know about it. And we see here that things began to change with voting rights and voting for more. I'll tell you about two calls that changed history. Dr. King in October of 1960, had been arrested with some other protesters at Rich's department store, desegregating the lunch counters. And Dr. King had a license that had expired. It was from Alabama, where he lived before he came to Georgia when he was pastor at Dexter Baptist Church in Montgomery. And he was sentenced to 4 months of hard labor in a maximum security prison in Reidsville, Georgia. Now, at that time, this was 1 month before the November election of 1960. Richard Nixon had a lot of black friends, including Jesse Owens and even Jackie Robinson and even Martin Luther King Sr. And so they pleaded to both candidates at this point. It was Richard Nixon or the senator from Massachusetts named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Richard Nixon refused to get involved. He would not make a phone call. But the senator from Massachusetts, John Kennedy, did make a call. He made 2 calls. He made one to Coretta Scott and told him he would do what he could to get Dr. King released from that hard labor at the maximum security prison. And he made a call also to the governor of Georgia. And the next day, Martin Luther King Jr. was released from prison. Those were 2 calls that changed history. Now, what Daddy King said on the next day, and he said it publicly, Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr., here he is right here. He said, I want to thank this Senator Kennedy for doing what he did, for stepping up for my daughter-in-law. He stood up for Coretta Scott King, and he changed his support. He was supporting Nixon. He changed his support. This is Reverend King Sr. changed his support to John F. Kennedy, and so did Black America. And so, of course, he wanted his daughter and his 2 beautiful granddaughters. He probably had all of them in mind when he was so grateful that Senator John Kennedy had made that call, and that changed America, because now Kennedy won by a razor-thin margin, 323,000 votes nationwide, and they said, man, it could have gone any way. If it could have gotten a few votes here or there, Nixon would have been president, and we don't know how the country would have progressed. But that Voting Rights Act, those 2 phone calls, and the fact that now blacks could vote, Smith versus Allwright was a very important decision that Thurgood made there. So now they could vote, and they voted for Kennedy, and that was the power that gave Kennedy the victory, and Kennedy would be a bigger friend of civil rights and its movements after all of these things happened, from Miss Coretta and from Martin Luther King Sr. to give him the victory. Now, we should also recognize that now we're in 1961, and you see right here John Lewis, who was arrested about 24 times or so, and you can look at his head and see the bandages. That it was not only Bloody Sunday, which was in 1965, that we saw John Lewis just beaten and, you know, very severely, but we can see the bandages there from John Lewis, who is right there beside Dr. King, as early as 1961. We should also be very much aware of in Mississippi, which had so many challenges all over that state, Fannie Lou Hamer is a tremendous, courageous hero who is very known for many quotes that she said. She was so brave and beaten severely, imprisoned, shot at, threatened, but she never gave up. She was often tired, and she had a quote that is now on her tombstone. Fannie Lou Hamer said, "I'm so sick and tired of being sick and tired." And so she voiced what many black Americans were feeling. She said, "We're still getting hung and lynched and shot at and treated badly," but she continued to fight. And she took a group up to the Democratic Convention and made her presence felt. But she was a courageous hero. Ambassador Andrew Young preached her eulogy, as he has done for so many people throughout our history, and that's Fannie Lou Hamer in Mississippi. Now we take a chance to look at what happened at the world famous Edmund Pettus Bridge. This is when Selma, a city that had a large population of black people, about 50% black, but only 2% of the blacks were registered to vote. So they decided to protest the voting rights in Selma, Alabama. And on March the 7th, what was known as Bloody Sunday took place in Selma, Alabama. And as you know, John Lewis and Hosea Williams led that march from SNCC. John Lewis represented the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and conference. And then also you had Hosea Williams representing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is what Dr. King and Joseph Lowry had started. And it turned that they were just treating so severely and so poorly in that. And one other thing that happened, it was a lady that had participated in voting rights administration and done everything she could to help the cause. Her name was Bernice Sims. She had 6 children, a single parent raising those kids, was basically an uneducated lady, loved art, and she would just like to draw images of what she had seen. Bernice had knee problems. She later had knee replacements. She was unable to participate, but she stood and watched. She sit in a building and watched them cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And as a folk artist, she wanted to draw that, leave it for her kids and for everyone else. So I would like to show you some of the artwork of Bernice Sims. And it shows that we all can be a part of history, maybe in ways that we were not even aware of. Bernice Sims, this is her original artwork and of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And you can see what she saw, and she combined that with some other images of how blacks were treated in Alabama at that time. She is also from Alabama with the dogs and everything else. Beautiful artwork by Bernice Sims, who only started drawing when she was in her 60s and was what is known as an untrained artist, folk artist. She did later take some art classes at a community college. But the beauty about this also is they adopted this and used it in a postage stamp. And we'll take a look at the postage stamp up here. To form a more perfect union. And it was a series of different art renditions, and there is her painting crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And I thought that it's so beautiful what Bernice had done, just her contribution, what she wanted to leave to her kids and to others, what she saw and felt, what was important to her. And she knew that getting voting rights was important to her. She knew that that march across that bridge was important to her and many others, and she documented it herself. So we salute and we know about Bernice Sims, the folk artist that made a painting crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Now, after that brutality, we should note what happened. LBJ, President Johnson, a little over a week later, he said, oh, we got to have some voting rights right away. These people are dying and getting treated poorly and getting beaten. We must have voting rights. So he called right then on Congress. I want y'all to work nights and weekends on this bill. We're talking about 1965. He wanted the bill passed, the voting rights bill, and he pushed extremely hard to make that voting rights bill happen. And it did happen in 1965. That was a very important document. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, and that gave blacks a lot more opportunity to vote, and they took full advantage of it. Also, we might note that the poll tax a year later was banned. Poll tax was where you were charged to vote. You had to show a receipt that you had paid your poll tax or you couldn't vote. Now, I talked about Fannie Lou Hamer a little earlier. She did not pass the literacy test until her third time. She told them, well, y'all just get used to it because I'm going to keep coming every time until I pass it. She finally passed it, and then when she went to vote, they said, oh, where's your poll tax receipt? You can't vote. You don't have a poll tax receipt. So finally, the poll tax, the literacy test, the grandfather's clause, the registration tricks, so many ways to suppress a very important thing, your vote. And so now, finally, poll tax was banned. And so Johnson's administration did a lot of things for civil rights and banning the poll tax. And we'll take a look right here also under Johnson administration. Literacy test was banned. So now you don't ever have to go to the polls and pass a literacy test where you have to read passages maybe from the Constitution or answer a question. What does de facto laws mean? They may ask you those kinds of questions. And John Lewis often told they would ask how much bubble gum is in this barrel of bubble gum that may be thousands, So any questions like that are now illegal to prevent you from voting. So this was all part of that administration. Now, with more voting rights, you've got people in the state of Georgia playing prominent roles. Let's talk about this man here, Julian Bond. Brilliant man. His dad had been a professor at Lincoln University, one of the first HBCUs, that's historically black college and university in Pennsylvania. So he had grown up with Paul Robeson and Du Bois coming by his home. He had learned so many things. He helped to found SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, while he was a student at Morehouse. And years later, he helped found the Southern Poverty Law Center, where he was their first president for over 8 years. So Julian Bond was elected in 1965 to serve in Congress. The fellow congressman decided they didn't want to let him have a seat. He had stood up against the war in Vietnam, and they thought he should not be seated, and they voted that he could not be seated. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and he actually won that case, and then he was seated in 1966, and he served for 20 years in Congress. Brilliant, fought for many rights, fought to desegregate lunch counters, fought to get voting rights and register people to vote. Julian Bond was a huge figure in voting rights in this country, and a chairman of the NAACP later on in his life as well. Tremendous intellectual leader. We should never forget Julian Bond as a tremendous Georgian. Also, we had Shirley Chisholm, who in 1968 served in Congress. Barbara Jordan had been elected to Congress as the first black woman. She was the second, though, from New York. Not only did she serve those years in Congress for about 13 years, she also ran for president in 1972. Shirley Chisholm ran for president under the Democratic ticket there, and she was the first black to do that and the first woman to do that. So she paved the way not only for Barack Obama or Kamala Harris or Hillary Clinton or anybody that wanted to run for president or in an election of that nature, where you're a woman or a black person, you owe some allegiance to Shirley Chisholm. Okay, and here we see Dr. King in the latter years of his life still planning, strategizing how to get equality, and you see some of the speeches in his final march after he'd had his first funeral at Ebenezer Baptist Church. 100,000 followed over to Morehouse College for a second service for Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the last thing I want to show is Shelby County right here. That in 2013, the voting barrier still brewed in what state, Texas, that there had been so much trouble on, and they gutted the Civil Rights Act. So now the states that had problems with civil rights and suppressing black votes, now they do not have to get clearance from the federal government. They can change voting rights laws. They can require different kinds of ID, what hours you have it. They can make any changes they want to without getting clearance in advance. That's because the voting rights had been gutted. And a lot of people protested that. Ruth Bader Ginsburg certainly did not vote. She dissented. She did not agree with that 5-4 vote for that act. And I want to tell you about 50-year anniversary of the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Of course, you see John Lewis there. You see President Obama. And how about Amelia Boynton? She had been in the planning stages. Dr. King would meet in her kitchen and they would plan out what they were going to do and how they were going to carry this out. She was 104 years old and she crossed that bridge this time without being hurt or injured in any way or form, with a black president right to her right. So Amelia Boynton, congratulations. And of course, Reggie Lewis and so many other heroes, Al Sharpton. There were so many people that participated in this march, 50-year anniversary. And of course, you see, John Lewis was very central in that. And as we bring all of this forward with all of this voting and voting history, and we see that Kamala Harris was voted as Vice President of the United States, achieving a first. So she is a part, and she's very much aware of the fact that she's a part of all of this history that allowed her to reach this high status that she has reached. And she knows also that a very important lady in her success was right here, Stacey Abrams, who really wrote an outstanding book that everyone should read. She talked about all the ways that votes had been suppressed even when she was running for governor of Georgia, and she wanted to counter those ways. And obviously she had a lot of success, and a lot of Georgians pitched in with her and aided her in those efforts, not only to get Biden and Harris elected. She also, in the senatorial race that was in a runoff, and that she got Georgia officially turned blue from red, but participation and people having the right to vote and exercising their right also. And so this last section is people that we have lost that we have to pay tribute to. We acknowledge, first of all, Juanita Abernathy. I'm going to start with her. I refuse to let Juanita Abernathy be not included. She was very instrumental all the way back to Montgomery. She and Ralph David Abernathy were part of the Montgomery Improvement Association and Montgomery's history to fight that busing acts there. So Juanita Abernathy was there until her death. She was very instrumental in everything for rights and for voting rights. And so we salute Juanita Abernathy, who died in 2019. Of course, that year, Joseph Lowery, who was a co-founder with Dr. King of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. He was just a lone warrior that really a true leader and icon for Atlanta. C.T. Vivian was another guy that played such a big role in the civil rights movement and voting rights and protests, and you see a young C.T. Vivian here. And I'm just going to mention Diane Nash too. Please don't ever forget Diane Nash, who led many of the Nashville sit-ins at lunch counters. Brilliant leader was Diane Nash, who is still alive and in her 80s, 82 or 3 at this time. You don't see her out as much, but Diane Nash, along with C.T. Vivian, were really leaders at that time. And lastly, we get a look at Representative John Lewis, a lifelong leader, Georgia legend, and we know that he did so many things, and it's at this time that we really salute, celebrate, recognize the accomplishments and the struggle and the fight of John Lewis. And that's the conclusion of the exhibit on voting rights and struggle for equality. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. We got so much information about the history of voting rights in America. So thank you so much, Mike, for the time that you take to all the work that you put into this. So we really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Ms. Taylor. Thank you.
You.